Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Henchman's Memoirs. Today we are talking about pantheons and faiths. Creating your own custom pantheon for your D&D campaign is something that most DMs enjoy doing. It's a ton of fun. It's a great way to sort of bake in some of the themes and ideas and conflicts that are going to be part of your campaign. But as I look at the different pantheons that are out there in some of the published campaigns and some of the homebrew campaigns that I've seen people talk about online, I'm disturbed to see that it seems like a lot of the same options keep getting picked over and over, such that we end up with this kind of sameness to some of the campaigns. And I wanted to talk today about some other options that you could have for your pantheons to kind of get your creative juices flowing about other possibilities. So over here on this side of the tape, we're going to be talking about sort of the default settings, and over here we're going to be talking about some new ideas we might want to try when we're creating our own campaign pantheons. So the first thing that I see is that most of the campaign worlds that are out there have polytheism as the default for what the mythology and so forth of the campaign is. This goes back, I think, probably to Gary Gygax and the original Greyhawk campaign. Gary was called on to ask what god one of his players was following, and he made up Saint Cuthbert on the spot. And he later went on to make a whole pantheon of gods that were followed in Greyhawk. And now it's the same thing in the Forgotten Realms. It's the same thing in Galarian. It's the same thing in most of the campaigns. But I think we should think about the possibility of using monotheism for our campaign settings. Now, the thing about polytheism is it really doesn't fit time-wise with most high fantasy campaigns. By the time Central Europe had knights in armor and heavy crossbows and great big castles with stone walls, Christianity had mostly displaced in that part of the world the pagan polytheisms that had been there beforehand. Hundreds of years where Christianity had kind of become entrenched in Central Europe before we reach the time period that is kind of the baseline for most campaigns. Now, I hear you saying, well, Henchman, I don't care about historical accuracy. I'm creating a world where dragons breathe fire and wizards throw spells, and I understand that. Here's the thing. When we introduce polytheism into sort of a medieval fantasy setting, I feel like we immediately take one step away from kind of the groundedness and the sort of grittiness of the campaign. And one example I give for this is the Curse of Strahd campaign and the Ravenloft campaign. Ravenloft is meant to be obviously more of a dark fantasy horror kind of setting, and so it's meant to feel a little bit more grounded than, say, the Forgotten Realms in history. And you notice in this setting, you basically have the Morning Lord standing in for the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, right? This gives the campaign, I think, more of a grounded feel, and makes the campaign feel a little bit more, shall we say, historical. Now, the interesting thing that sort of the feel of this gives us, you'll notice, for example, if we're in a standard polytheism, right, and the players are going from one little hamlet to another, there's a question, well, do they follow the same god in this new town? Like, our cleric is a follower of Zeus. Is the person in this new town a follower of Hermes or a follower of Ra? And how do the different sort of churches and cults get along together within this polytheism? I think most of us have the feeling like in medieval Europe, if you're a cleric, you're a cleric. If you're a priest, you're a priest, and you go from town to town, and you're sort of recognized as being part of that. And I feel like that's what gives Ravenloft a more grounded feel. So it's something to think about whether or not you want to include monotheism as the central idea of the campaigns you're creating. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, but henchman, my cleric wants to be like a cleric of the sea, or a cleric of motherhood, or a cleric of fire, right? There is a way to do that within monotheism. We've already seen Gavin Norman do it in the Dolmenwood campaign. You simply have patron saints for all of those things, right? So you have the patron saint of travelers and navigators, and you have an order within the church dedicated to these different patron saints. You get the same effect that you would have gotten from having separate gods, or you can do the thing that they did in the Grim Hollow campaign setting, where you have angels that represent sort of the different spheres that a cleric or a paladin might want to be a part of, and they just stand in for that, but you still have the feel of a sort of more historical monotheism. So the next question number 2 we're going to ask and answer about our campaign: are our gods immanent and personal? So this is sort of a theology school term, but it basically means the gods are close, they're accessible, you can have a conversation with the gods in this campaign setting. The other option that almost nobody seems to take is to have the gods be more transcendent, or almost more concepts than actual persons that you can get on the line and pray to. A lot of pantheons that I've seen kind of want to come down on both sides of this divide. So you want to tell stories about your campaign. You want to tell stories about the gods when they first made the world, and talk about how, Grumsh got his eye gouged out by Corillin Lantharion or whoever it was. You want to create these kind of stories about them that are reminiscent of the stories that we see in pagan polytheism. But then by the time the campaign is happening, you really want the gods to sort of be more distant and transcendent, and be kind of more concepts than actual people that you can just gate to their home dimension and talk to them the way you could like a devil. It's fine for Asmodeus to be an actual personal figure that can take direct action. But when it comes to the God of Storms, and you've got a campaign where Vecna is getting ready to destroy all of reality, I think it kind of breaks the immersion when you can just ask, why doesn't the High Priest just go talk to Helm about it and see why he won't give us some help? Sometimes they try to create some kind of deal where the gods can't intervene, or there's some kind of truce between the gods where they have to act through their followers. But basically, you can start off with the gods being more sort of concepts, and then it really becomes dealing with the mortal high priest, the followers who have their own agendas and have their own sort of weaknesses and so forth. Maybe they're obviously not as all-knowing and all-seeing as the god of the sky is supposed to be. And so it brings things down to a more manageable level when we actually get into the campaign. Now, the third big difference that I think we should be considering as we're creating our pantheons, this is my personal favorite one. It has to do with whether the gods themselves are contemporaries, or whether we have the old gods and the new gods. So in most pagan polytheisms, the gods are more or less a family, right? You've got Poseidon and Hades and Zeus are brothers. And then their descendants are all, the other gods and so forth are their children and offspring. And basically you have a situation, when I say the gods are contemporaries, you either have a situation where they created the world together, right? And they're all sort of part of the same generation. Or you have a situation where maybe like in the Norse mythology, right? The giants actually created the earth, and the Aesir and the Vanir came in and took over, and they are the gods of the Norse people. But they sort of created at least humanity. Right? And so they're all part of the same social structure. They're all part of the same group as we see them portrayed in the mythology. But a much more interesting way to do it is to create sort of the old gods and the new gods. And there are two very distinct ways of handling this. The first way to handle the old versus new thing is basically the H.P. Lovecraft method, right? So in this case, the old gods are a whole pantheon of pre-human, mad, insane gods from the far star realms, and they were worshipped and ruled over these races before human beings even came down from the trees and discovered fire, right? The old gods are the old ones. They're these terrible, horrific, pre-human beings, and they're mostly forgotten. They're mostly asleep. They're, waiting for the stars to be right before they can come back. And I think we all sort of have some experience with how the old gods can be presented. But the other way to do it, and this is the E. Gary Gygax and George R. Martin way to do it, you can create a setup in your campaign where the old gods represent sort of pre-Christian paganism, and the new gods represent sort of a new pantheon or a new god that's moving in to sort of displace these older faiths. When you do this second sort of old-new split, almost always the old gods are sort of more connected to nature, they're more down to earth, they're more approachable, and the new gods tend to represent medieval Catholicism, so they're much more judgy and much more extremist and all these things. So E. Gary Gygax, the old faith, was basically Druidism in Greyhawk. And then there were new gods that had come in, St. Cuthbert and Pelor and all of them had come with a new wave of conquering peoples. And so you had this dichotomy between the two. George R. R. Martin did the same thing in A Song of Ice and Fire. In the North, the old gods and the new gods are prayed to by the Starks and so forth. The old gods sort of represent these, like I say, more druidic feeling gods. They are worshipped by these trees that have like a face in them. But then the new gods are the gods worshipped by the High Sparrow and so forth. I think there's either 7 or 9 faces, but even those are all supposed to be all part of one god. So you can create an interesting split in your campaign, not just between like good gods and evil gods or lawful gods and chaotic gods, but you can create a split between gods that were worshipped in this area before this new faith came in to kind of displace it, and then the edicts and teachings of the new gods, and sort of the cultural pressure between those two is very fertile ground for some creativity, and also is going to feel, just like it does in Song of Ice and Fire, it is going to feel more grounded because it is related to something historical that we are all familiar with. Number 4, just briefly, I think it's interesting to think about whether your gods are international or cultural. So what I see in most default pantheons is the god of war, the god of the sky, the god of, mothers and the hearth. These gods are worshipped in all the good nations, right? The same god of justice is the god of justice for the entire world of Greyhawk, right? That doesn't necessarily have to be how you want to do it. You can have a situation where there is a different god of justice that is worshipped by a different group of people in a different country. Both countries are what you might consider good, or both countries might be what you consider evil. But you can literally have different pantheons for different parts of your world, and you can even create sort of a historically realistic situation where the gods of this group of people and the gods of this group of people are thought to be at war when those peoples are at war. This isn't just a question of who's going to control this river and control this fertile valley. This is a question of whose God is greater or whose God is real. And so you can have conflicts between pantheons where different gods are claiming the same spheres of influence, and you can spread them out in different parts of your world. It's more work, and it does lend credence. It does raise the question of, well, if they have different creation myths in different cultures, which set of gods really created humanity, or are they both sort of full of it? Those are all interesting questions that can be answered. You don't necessarily have to play the gods of the other side as all being corrupt and evil, and our gods as necessarily being the good guys. And number 5, just something to think about. This has to do with your pantheon, but it also has to do with how your pantheon interacts with world building. So what I've noticed in most of the sort of default, sort of generic pantheons that I see is basically you've got the king, or more likely in modern settings, the Lord Mayor of the town, or some sort of noble who is in charge of the whole kingdom or duchy or whatever. And then he's got his high priest, and he's got his master wizard, and he's got his spy master, and they are all working together for him. So he's got his army, and then he's got the priesthood is bringing to bear their paladins and clerics, and the sorcerers are bringing to bear all of their firepower, and everybody's one big happy family, and it's squeaky clean. Everybody's working together effortlessly. What you can do instead is you can set up early in your campaign, maybe there's a lot of friction between the high priest and the Lord Mayor or king or emperor or whatever you have going on. Maybe the high priest does not approve of the king's marriage, or doesn't approve of who he's chosen to be his successor. Maybe they give sanctuary to political dissidents that the king wants to have arrested or pilloried or whatever, and the church protects them. And the only way the king could get at him would be to just send his soldiers in and kill a bunch of nuns and altar boys and stuff to get this. You can create all kinds of tension between the church and the leadership of certain countries. Again, if you go back up here, you could have different churches represent or dealing with different leaders and rulers, or it could be different branches of the Church of Odin that is dealing with, all the kings of these different lands. But there doesn't necessarily need to be a perfectly harmonious relationship between the crown and the creed. You can create all kinds of different conflicts between them. Now, yes, when the ogre army is invading and the world is at stake, obviously they're going to work together for the common good. But when the stakes are a little bit lower or situations are a little bit different, maybe the church is more interested in being the power behind the throne. Even if they're a good church, they don't necessarily have to be, corrupt or misrepresenting who they stand for. Maybe they feel like the church should have more of a say on the city council or the small council or whatever you're doing. So spend some time thinking about the relationship between the creed and the crown before you finalize and introduce your pantheon to your group. So these are 5 things to just think about and kick around before you introduce your idea for your pantheon to your players. If you like what we're doing, give us a like, give us a subscribe, and join us next time for the Henchman's Memoirs.